Hi, Kira. Thank you for letting me observe your class.
You're very welcome, Jackie.
So, can you explain to me what class I will be observing?
The class you're going to be observing is the first semester of English 11, and in that class we are reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Coming up, which you'll be observing, is kind of a little break from that, but in the same realm of looking at history during that time period, and specifically the Dred Scott case versus Sanford.
What kind of students do you have in that class?
I have a mix of students. So I have students that do very well in English, are very comfortable with English in terms of reading and writing. And I have students that are kind of in the middle. And then I have students that English is not their strongest subject.
So, how do you tend to the mix of students, especially the students that need support?
In terms of students that need support, I do have an EL learner in there. So what I do is I will go through a lesson with the class as a whole, and then he will then go and work with the ELA team that will work with him. I describe what that lesson is, what the expectations of that lesson are, and then he will work with that team to accomplish that lesson.
For his testing, do they use the same test material or is curriculum modified?
I do have him use the same the actual testing material, assessment material, but in terms of the time that he has to complete it, I give him a little bit of a longer time. He then gets to work with the ELA team, which they will break it down and discuss before he actually puts pen to paper, if that makes sense.
Yes. So then describe your classroom setting and how that affects your teaching.
I don't find the EL learner particularly, that's not really disruptive in my classroom. I think I'm very lucky to have support in that area to actually support him in completing those assessments and working on certain assignments. I did have a student who unfortunately wasn't able to function in terms of behavior in the class. He was extremely disruptive to both himself and people in that class. The steps that we took initially to address that student, to help him be successful, were to work with the school psychologist. We had several meetings with the vice principal, with his parents, so we could figure out what would work best for him. Anytime a student, regardless of level, has difficulty completing the tasks or focusing in class, there's always a plan that's first put in place, which is to first talk with the student, and let's say the vice principal, or the student, the vice principal, and the teacher, to first address what is he or she having difficulty with. Is it the focusing in class? Is it the assignments themselves? Or is it both?
Is it the type of school that we are kind of affect the type of subject that you're teaching, especially the different types of levels?
I think that we'll have, a mix of students here, and we have students that come here who have very large gaps in their learning, be that in math, be that in English. I think a lot of what we find is students who didn't attend middle school or had maybe a history of ditching school really lost out on the foundational skills. So there's a lot of kind of remediation in terms, I find, which can be tricky when you have students that already have that foundation. So there are times when I'm focusing on remediation and say one or two students who I know they're already comfortable with, say, nouns and writing in complete sentences. I'll give them a separate task, or I'll have them work on an assignment that maybe due for homework, so that they're not necessarily wasting their time. I'll also do something where I challenge the student themselves. So here's the assignment that is kind of in the medium road, the middle road of students' skills. And I said, well, challenge yourself, go above and beyond what this assessment is asking of you. Do research outside of here, not just the research that I provided you with. It is a challenge to tackle that with multiple learners in a classroom. So a lot of times I aim for the middle ground, and then I have to readjust when I realize this assignment isn't as challenging as it could be for this student. So then I'll have to kind of pose the challenge to them and say, well, why don't you take this a step further, do extra research on this, or take this particular stance on it. Maybe take a stance that you don't believe and challenge yourself. Or students are comfortable writing arguments, so I encourage them to write a counter argument. So that's kind of how I deal with those students that are maybe performing at a higher level in terms of English. Students that are performing at a lesser, I don't like to say lesser, maybe they're not as comfortable with English. Instead of providing 2 pieces of evidence, let's provide 1. Let's work on introducing the quote. Let's work on getting the direct quote cited properly, and how do we explain this? So we are a school that students come to with many different levels of knowledge in terms of English and math and history and so forth.
When I come to observe your class, English 11, what do you want me to observe in particular?
I think that, there's some students I've noticed that because they don't have a liking to English, that's kind of tainted their mood for that day. Maybe there are ways that you can help me to encourage those students so that they don't get bogged down by the fact that they don't enjoy the subject, and that kind of stunts their wanting to learn in that particular class. That would be one area that would be really helpful. I'm trying to think. If students are comprehending the material, we have some students that are shyer, so they don't necessarily participate as much as I'd like to. I use some quantum strategies where I'll I'll definitely always repeat to ensure comprehension, and then I'll actually specifically ask a student, what do you understand from this, or what is a little bit cloudy or foggy that you need a little bit more explanation. I think this year I've done a lot of outlines, which are kind of archaic, because students have a hard time organizing their thoughts. So I provide a very detailed outline, and then I provide a blank outline for them to actually plug in the information, so that can help them to actually write a composition. Some students are more comfortable with that, so they kind of use that as a guide, but they do their own outline on, say, a notebook.
And me coming in as well, how can I assist you?
I think, outside of looking for those students that are not excited about being in English, that might be one way. I think also, how can I, as a teacher, meet the needs of this mixture of learners? Because that's what we have, is just a very big mix of students at different levels. And I think for me that is challenging. So am I challenging those that are more comfortable with English? Am I meeting the needs of those students that are right where they should be in 11th grade? Am I also meeting the needs of those students that are not as comfortable with English? So I think that would be great to receive any type of feedback on how I can tailor those lessons to meet each student's needs.
And basically that's what this class is all about, is me learning how to be a better coach, not just an assistant principal who supervises and manages, but alongside with that is that everyday task, but also develop my skills in being a more effective coach. So then thank you for volunteering, because that's actually what you're giving me the opportunity with, is I'm reading these books on coaching and how to approach this. So I'll be observing you, giving you feedback, so therefore you can give your students feedback.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.